Hello to all the real progressives out there. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I think we have a fantastic show for everybody. Unfortunately, the guest I was going to have on had something come up at the last minute, so we don't have any guests today. We're going to make up for that in the next couple of weeks with tons of fantastic guests. A lot of stories to cover, though, today. We're going to dive into the reconciliation bill and the way the media has covered that. We're going to discuss Jeff Bezos and other Amazon executives' lies to Congress pertaining to their anti-competitive practices and basically stealing products from other companies. It's a whole thing. We're going to talk about how Israel has designated human rights organizations as terrorist groups, and a whole bunch of other stories for you guys. Katie Couric, Censors, RBG's horrific thoughts on the BLM protests. Lots of stuff to dive into today. Do want to start with the Real Progressive plugs. Make sure that you are visiting realprogressives.org to find all of our fantastic content. Our Patreon is there if you'd like to contribute to our organization. All sorts of podcasts and articles and great stuff. realprogressives.org. So I want to start today with a rather comedic clip, actually. This is Jon Stewart, who is one of my all-time favorites. I miss The Daily Show very much, or I should say his version of The Daily Show very much. He went on CNN and essentially told Jake Tapper to his face that the question he had just asked is part of the problem when it comes to how the media covers Congress in D.C. It was really rather hilarious. I don't even think that Tapper seemed to notice how much Stewart was essentially calling him out right to his face. Jon Stewart here criticizing the media for finding the divisive and finding the conflict that they can sell their brand on, as opposed to covering the details in a way that would be, responsible. So this is Jon Stewart on CNN telling Jake Tapper to his face what a significant part of the problem he is.
It's pretty cynical strategy.
There's a big debate going on right now in the Democratic Party about how to appeal to voters in 2022. There are a lot of social issues getting a lot of attention. Governor Gavin Newsom in California just signed a law requiring gender-neutral toy sections in stores. There's obviously a lot of debate across the country, not all of it well-informed, about critical race theory and how race is taught in schools. What do you have concerns about how these debates are taking place? Obviously, I'm not talking about how they're depicted in right-wing media, because it doesn't matter what the Democrats do or liberals do for right-wing media to lie about it. But there are a number of independent voters who might not understand what's going on.
Yeah. There are a lot of things a lot of people don't understand, and something's either right and common sense. I do think there are ways to accomplish some of these goals in ways but you can't govern to the lowest common denominator. You can't. I think one of the difficulties, and again, it's with the way that the lens through which we view everything is based on, and what will that mean for the midterms? Or what I saw a great headline in Politico as Afghanistan was descending into chaos in that final week. And the headline in Politico, this was the top line headline, the one with the 40 point font, whatever it was. It said, "Why Afghanistan may not matter in the midterms." And then the subhead was, "And why it might."
Wow.
And I think
they have a point. They have a point.
But that's our journalism, right, man? Isn't that how many times have you seen stories about the battle over masks? That's the Karen yelling in the store and the people throwing them out and all that. And how many stories have we seen about the efficacy of masks or the why or the actual, there are some, but the overwhelming majority of stories seek to expose the conflict lines.
Absolutely spot on there from Jon Stewart. He tells Jake Tapper to his face, the question you just asked me is clearly designed to bring in clicks and viewership and expose the conflict lines rather than, educate or bring knowledge or information or a particularly compelling perspective to the viewership, right? And I think the last example he gives there is a really perfect one. We've all seen the clips, and I'm not even saying they aren't newsworthy, you guys, but we've all seen the clips of like people screaming at each other over masks or vaccines or what have you. And again, it's not that that's not newsworthy or worth sharing. It's that when the media only approaches it from that angle, instead of saying, let's talk to some microbiologists about why masks are effective or why the vaccine is effective. When the media, like weaponizes that conflict line for its own benefit, you end up with a less informed, more ignorant public. And I think Jon Stewart is absolutely spot on in his criticism. And you notice how Jake doesn't even seem to recognize what Jon is saying, because I put the whole question in there for a reason. You guys got to hear the way that Jake Tapper framed that question. And how did he frame it? It wasn't what parts of this bill might help people. What are your thoughts on the policy here? With nothing to do with that whatsoever. What's your thought on the state of the country or the political environment, whatever? No, it was, how might this affect the Democrats in the midterms? That's how they frame everything. And Stewart tells him to his face that that's part of the problem, that we view everything through this hyper-partisan lens. And Jake just kind of laughs along with him as though he doesn't understand that he's being quite heavily criticized. I miss Jon Stewart quite a bit, you guys. The Daily Show was absolutely fantastic. Those were back in the days when even Stephen Colbert was pretty decent back on Comedy Central. I don't know what the hell happened to him. But we used to have this kind of satirical, political, almost halfway news. You know what I mean? Like, I honestly think Jon Stewart was a better source of news than most cable news outlets at any given time. I don't even really think that's up for debate. Like, so we used to have that, and it I don't really know who that would be today. No offense to Trevor Noah, but he's definitely not Jon Stewart, right? And I think that presence is sorely missed because of exactly what you just saw. He's just willing to call it like it is, right to people's faces. And Jon Stewart always, also every single year, or maybe not every year, but whenever it comes to a vote to like put off providing medical care for 9/11 first responders, Jon Stewart is the one that goes public and shames Congress into providing that medical care to first responders from 9/11, which they obviously are entitled to. So, Stewart just is a fantastic actor in the political process and seems to understand the leverage and the power that he has and uses it well. And I wish he was more in the public spotlight than he is because of stuff like what you just saw. So good on Jon Stewart, and shame on Jake Tapper and the whole media for covering this in the way that they covered it. And we're going to dive into some more of those details here with Bernie Sanders criticizing the media as well for how they frame the reconciliation package. Instead of actually sharing what the details are, the media tends to only cover the top line numbers, right? So you have these ridiculous, meaningless, callow questions like, well, what top line number would you be okay with? Where will you compromise? As though like there's any substance in just saying, well, 2 trillion or 2.5 trillion. You have to know what that's being spent on. What's actually in the bill? Otherwise, it's a totally meaningless conversation, right? And the media just kind of uses these big scary numbers and fear mongers about it, and then asks the questions in that fashion. So it's covered like a horse race, right? Instead of covering the actual policy details here, instead of covering it like politics. But to dive into the reconciliation situation, and we have a whole lot to talk about in that arena today, I want to start with a clip from David Sirota on Breaking Points. David Sirota, obviously fantastic journalist. He is with the Daily Poster. And he went on to Breaking Points to explain his view on progressives' position on the reconciliation bill and what he thinks Biden should do if Biden is actually serious about the provisions that he claims and purports to want to be in the bill and have strong feelings about, right? Like free community college, for example, which the Biden administration has made a huge deal out of and refused to do anything about, even though they have the power to. That's a whole different discussion, which we'll get into here shortly. But this is David Sirota on Breaking Points.
Time for our weekly segment in partnership with the Daily Poster, highlighting their original journalism. Joining us now, we have the founder of Daily Poster, David Sirota. Great to see you, David.
Good to see you, David.
Good morning.
So you have an interesting piece out right now with regards to the reconciliation bill and where we're at. I personally think the Biden proposal is total trash. You are calling on the administration to call the bluff of Manchin, Sinema, and all of the other people who are more quietly dragging their heels. Let's throw this tear sheet up on the screen. You say, call their bluff right now. It's time for Democratic leaders to make Manchin, Sinema, and every other senator vote, and not on some gutted half measure, but on a real $3.5 trillion bill. Explain your thinking there.
Well, look, we've seen the negotiations whittle down this bill to, it looks like it's going to almost nothing. I mean, it started out, Bernie Sanders said it should have been 10 trillion. So he started out at 6 trillion. Joe Manchin said he could accept $4 trillion of spending. Then it went to 3.5 trillion. Then it went to 1.9 trillion. Then Manchin said it's 1.5 trillion. Point being that the delays continue to result in exactly what Manchin and Sinema and other conservative Democrats, what their donors want, which is basically a bill that is gutted or killed. We wrote about this back in August, which is what we said was that what was probably going to happen is that the House progressives who are saying that they're going to hold out, if they don't make their demands explicitly clear what exactly they want in a reconciliation bill, then likely you will see a process where the Democratic leadership guts that bill, just keeps hollowing it out. And you've seen Manchin and Sinema make periodic statements through the press. Oh, we don't like the tax provisions. Oh, we don't like the pharmaceutical provisions. Oh, we don't like the climate provisions. And every time they make a declaration like that, the White House and Congress go to work on hacking apart the bill. So the point is, instead of engaging in that process, instead of engaging in what is obviously a deliberate game, a game that Manchin and Sinema and their donors want to play, stop playing that game and put a real bill on the floor and simply have a vote. Now, that doesn't guarantee that Manchin and Sinema will vote for a good bill, but it basically puts them on the spot in a way that they're not on the spot right now. They have the best of both worlds right now. They get to make these declarations through the press, have the bill get watered down, have Democrats essentially negotiate against themselves, and never have to actually face an up or down vote. You know, there's one idea there to have an up or down vote, put a bunch of stuff in there for Arizona and West Virginia, and try to dare them to explicitly vote against, major investments in their own state. And the fact that the Democratic leadership hasn't done this is really a signal that it's not necessarily all that serious about actually passing a real bill. This is something that the Democratic leadership could do right now. And it's been going on for weeks and weeks, if not months. And they have refused to do this.
David Srota on point as always. The Democrats here refusing to hold Manchin and Sinema to any form of account. There would at least be pressure on them if they brought this to a vote. I don't know if you guys have kept up on what has been dropped out of that bill, but it really seems like every time Sinema or Manchin runs to the press and says, I don't like this part, or I don't like that part, or this is too much, Democrats then go and, hastily chip away at their own bill to appease Sinema and Manchin in that regard. And it's pathetic. It's absolutely pathetic. I just want to point out that the last time Republicans held power, they basically passed their entire agenda through reconciliation on party lines. They didn't care about bipartisan bullshit like Biden seems to. They didn't waste political capital trying to say, we got to win because we worked with Republicans, or in their case, we worked with Democrats, right? They just got their agenda through because they had the power to do it. Republicans know how to wield power. Democrats do not. And a lot of that really, I should actually reword that in a sense. Democrats seem to very much misrepresent what their true agenda is. And therefore, when they have the power to enact the agenda that they purport to support, they refuse to because they don't, in many cases, actually support that agenda. There certainly are members of the party who very much support the reconciliation bill. I believe that. There are also many, many members of the party who don't really support it or don't support large portions of it, at least the $3.5 trillion that Bernie originally proposed. And therefore, they're all too happy to hide behind Manchin and Sinema and say, well, you know, I want it, but can't do it. Sorry. So you have this dynamic of a rotating villain, as it's been called, right? And I think that's a pretty accurate description. And if Biden wanted a lot of the things, you guys, here's the other part of this. A lot of the things that Biden claims to want that he wants put in this bill, he could just do by executive order. And that kind of reveals that he's a fraud on this, that he doesn't really prioritize them, or at the very least, that even if he supports the policy in theory, he's not going to act on it. It's not enough of a priority for him to do anything about, right? The community college thing is insane. Like the Jeff Stein, Washington Post reporter, said that one of the provisions that Biden and his wife both apparently feel very personally strong about is the free community college, tuition-free community college. Well, like, then why do they refuse to cancel student loan debt, you guys? That's something he could do by signing a pen. He doesn't need Congress to do it. You can do it by executive orders, just signing a piece of fucking paper, and he refuses to do it. So you see how it kind of reveals how much Biden actually cares about these issues, right? And that's also a no-brainer, you guys. It's not like there's reasonable opposition to that, right? It's a no-brainer. So I think Biden here kind of being revealed for having campaigned on issues that he never really intended to do a damn thing about. And he's now hiding behind Manchin and Sinema. And by the way, if anyone at home believes that, let's think back to the primary. How did they treat Bernie when it became clear that it was either going to be Joe Biden or Bernie Sanders that was the nominee for president? All of a sudden, a few strings are pulled behind closed doors, and boom, it's over. If you don't think Biden has strings to pull to whip Kristen Sinema and Joe Manchin in line, you're out of your goddamn mind. You're drinking the Kool-Aid. You know, your gullible's written on the fucking ceiling if you believe that. Okay? I got a bridge to sell you. How many more metaphors can I give you guys? There's no way that Biden doesn't have a simple decision here. He can pull some strings behind the scenes and Sinema and Manchin will fall in line. He's choosing not to. The same goes for Chuck Schumer. The same goes for Nancy Pelosi. They're choosing not to. Do not allow their rotating villain to deceive you. Okay. So to dive into, I talked about, I want to cover the media's coverage in a sense, critique the media's coverage of this whole negotiation process. This is in The Hill. Sanders blames media for Americans not knowing details of Biden's spending plan. Senate Budget, there's an ad. Senate Budget Committee Chair Bernie Sanders blamed the media in part for Americans not knowing what is in a sweeping social spending plan being negotiated by the White House and congressional Democrats. Sanders, in a statement, said it is absurd that many Americans don't know what is in President Biden's plan, and while cautioning that there could be many reasons for that, launched a broadside against how the bill has been covered by the press. Notice how The Hill covers this, you guys. Launched a broadside. They make it seem like Bernie's being unreasonable here, right? They can't just frame it objectively. They have to, anyhow. Quote, the reality that the mainstream media has done an exceptionally poor job in covering what actually is in the legislation, Sanders said. There have been endless stories about the politics of passing Build Back Better. The role, by the way, terrible name. I mean, only the Democrats could come up with Build Back Better, for fuck's sake. The role of the president, the conflicts in the House and the Senate, the opposition of 2 senators, the size of the bill, etc. But very limited coverage as to what the provisions of the bill are and the crises for working people that they address, he added. Sanders' statement comes as Democrats are struggling to break through on the spending plan amid an intense focus on the price tag for the bill and weeks of high-profile Democratic squabbling over the still being negotiated legislation. Democrats want to use the spending bill to carry some of their biggest priorities, including expanding Medicaid and Medicare, new child care and education benefits, combating climate change, and overhauling the tax code. The specifics of what Democrats will ultimately include are still in flux as they try to figure the size of the bill and what policies can unite their razor-thin majorities. So you see how The Hill frames this, you guys. It's insane. They make Bernie seem unreasonable for criticizing the media here. Well, luckily for us, we have a little bit of a breakdown here. This is from Adam Johnson. And, thought I had that up on the screen there. There we go. Adam Johnson says on October 18th, that's Breonna Kyler, who's on CNN, mocked progressives' claims CNN hadn't covered the substance of the reconciliation bill, showing as proof random out-of-focus screen caps. If you haven't seen that clip, she basically threw up like a few articles that were titled "What's in the reconciliation bill" and used that as proof that the media has been covering the substance of this bill. It was so ridiculous. It was anyway, and they were out of focus too. It was just so ridiculous. His colleague and I surveyed 12 CNN segments over a 4-day period. We found it was 91.3% horse race, you guys. They're not covering the substance at all. And in the few instances where it wasn't horse race, it was because they had like a progressive member of Congress on who was actually talking about the details. Someone like, say, Bernie Sanders. So she got all flippant and condescending and on her high horse and tried to tear Bernie down. It was quite a ridiculous segment. I'm also going to show you guys a little bit here from the actual article that he posted there. On reconciliation bill, CNN aired horse race coverage 11 times more than substance. CNN insists it adequately covers the substance of the $3.5 trillion social spending bill, but a survey of 3 of its major news programs tells a different story. A column survey of 12 segments on CNN's major news shows covering the reconciliation bill during the height of the debate reveals that the vast majority, or 91.3% of CNN's coverage, focused on horse race over the substance of the bill. The survey of CNN's coverage was done in response to an October 18th segment by CNN's Breonna Kyler, which mocked Senator Bernie Sanders for his claim that the mainstream media has done an exceptionally poor job covering what is actually in the legislation. You can watch the segment here. To offer evidence CNN has covered the substance of the reconciliation bill, Kyler quickly throws up a dozen screen caps ostensibly showing the outlet doing just this, but Sanders and other progressive critics of mainstream media didn't say CNN never covered the substance. They claim they did an exceptionally poor job covering what is actually in the legislation. More broadly, a claim borne out in an analysis of CNN's coverage. CNN has millions of dollars at its disposal and could have easily marshaled several of its researchers and reporters to do a robust analysis of its coverage of the reconciliation bill, share these findings using open source means, and prove beyond any reasonable doubt that Sanders and other progressive critics were being unfair and lashing out without basis to do so. Instead, it just cobbled together 12 screen caps, several of which ran after Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Senator Sanders, and others started registering complaints about a lack of substantive coverage. Simply asserted progressive claims of media bias are outlandish and offensive, and moved on. So again, here you guys see, you get a look at how the media functions. It reflexively defends itself, and it will do so in very disingenuous and out of context ways, right? So she decontextualizes the whole thing. She throws up a bunch of screen caps, many of which were in response to the criticism from progressives that they had not covered the substance here. And she treats that as proof that the media has actually adequately covered this bill. It's absolutely insane. Great research here from Adam Johnson and his colleague to tell us that 91.3% of that coverage was just horse race nonsense. So, that's part of the problem here, you guys, is it's obviously a multi-pronged problem, but to whatever extent, and I'm not naive enough to think it's a large extent, but to whatever extent the mainstream Democrats actually support major aspects of this bill, they have completely neglected to message on that, right? With few exceptions, Bernie being one of them. But most of the Democratic Party has just utterly neglected to talk about what's in the bill. They just participate in the horse race and the top line discussions instead of diving into the substance. So that's one problem. The other problem is very much the media, and Bernie is 100% right here. And these provisions are very popular as inadequate in many cases as they would be. So what we've seen is a lot of those popular provisions negotiated out of the bill. Much of the climate stuff has been negotiated out of the bill, including the primary program that would have decreased carbon emissions. We see the child tax credit, instead of becoming permanent, it's only extended to like an extra year. So that's a huge difference right there. We see tuition-free community college cut from the bill. We see much of the expansion of Medicare and Medicaid cut from the bill. Basically all of the good shit, you guys. I mean, seriously. Like it's a piece of garbage now. Even at $3.5 trillion, any regular viewers will know this. I was criticizing it for being inadequate as much as I thought, it's better to pass it than not. But even at $3.5 trillion, it was inadequate. Now they've chop that in less than half. And what they've taken out is most of the best portions of it. So now it's just a complete piece of garbage. And this is what Biden will tout as a victory. And I think that they politically have Washington brain rot in this particular situation. I think that they have this mentality that passing anything is something that they can go brag about. And I think that they think that voters care about bipartisanship. So I think they actually think that if they pass this watered down piece of shit, they can go back to their constituents and say, see, we worked with Republicans for infrastructure and we did the reconciliation and, you know, we're working for you. And I think they're naive enough to think that even as those voters look at that and go, that hasn't touched my life at all. Even as that's the case, I think that the Democrats are naive and ignorant enough to think that that will be a message that sells to their constituents. So they are allowing this bill to just be completely gutted. And that obviously was the plan from the start. And I also want to note, you guys, I wish I could cite who did this analysis. Boy, I wish I could cite who did this analysis. But some major lobbying group had basically come out and said that they were not at all concerned, a big business lobbying group, that they were not concerned about the $3.5 trillion bill because they knew it either was going to fail or get gutted. And they admitted in this, it was a leak of emails, and they admitted in it that the way they were going to attack it was by attacking the top line number out of context. So instead of saying you can't attack, like, you know, tuition-free community college, you can't attack expanding healthcare, you can't attack addressing the climate crisis. So instead, what you do is you attack the $3.5 trillion price tag and fearmonger about a big number without any context. It's totally unreasonable, it's incoherent, it's meaningless, but they know that it will work from a propaganda perspective. So that's exactly what they did, and it worked. And this, I just want to note, is why MMT is so fucking important, you guys. This is why it's so important. If the general populace understood MMT, they would not be frightened by some random number that's out of context. Okay? That would not be a strategy that would work. And if everybody understood MMT, then there would have to be a response from those in power in terms of how they go about messaging this stuff. And we would have chipped away at one of their most powerful propaganda tools. So cannot recommend, like, Stephanie Kelton, The Deficit Myth. Go read it if you haven't. Go to realprogressives.org and read our educational material on MMT, because it is very important to understand this stuff so that kind of bullshit does not work on you, that you're not fazed by their incoherent propaganda. So another aspect of this is obviously Manchin and Sinema, who, as much as they are the rotating villain, there are reasons why they are choosing to be the ones in this particular case. So this is in Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. They do great work. This is by Spencer Snyder. TV reports on Manchin and Sinema leave out their financial conflicts. So this is about how the media neglects to cover why Manchin and Sinema take the positions that they take. As of the October 31st deadline to vote on the bipartisan infrastructure, as the October 31st deadline to vote on the bipartisan infrastructure bill approaches, the media have made a project of examining Senators Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema's opposition to the $3.5 trillion reconciliation bill, also known as the Build Back Better Act. Despite countless hours of coverage and conjecture about what might or might not get Manchin and Sinema to vote for the bill, the financial conflicts of interest that reinforce their reluctance to vote on the bill have been almost completely ignored. In a review of 21 relevant news programs airing on October 3rd and 4th on ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, and MSNBC, financial conflicts were discussed for only 45 seconds. In fact, some of the media have attempted to help insulate Manchin and Sinema against such observations. On ABC's Good Morning America, former Senator Heidi Heitkamp, who, by the way, herself is corrupt as all fuck, said the impugning motivation is harmful, and that I've seen way too much of that as it relates to both Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin, and I think that needs to ratchet down. Well, gee, I wonder why Heidi Heitkamp, whose own intentions ought to be impugned, might say such a thing. Corruption is so pervasive in the media and in DC that that's treated as taboo to call it out, right? The television news media have instead chosen to engage in repetitious conjecture about what price between 1.5 and 3.5 trillion might be acceptable to which parties. One should note, as journalists rarely did, that $3.5 trillion is the cost of both spending and tax cuts over 10 years and represents approximately 1.25% of projected US GDP over that period. Sounds a lot less scary when you put it that way, doesn't it? Anyhow, so this is part of the problem too, you guys, is that the populace is so uneducated on the individual actors in this case. And Sinema and Manchin, their corruption is well documented. I don't need to tell you guys about it, you know. But the media has refused to report on that part of it. They just treat them as though they're principled, good faith actors who just happen to be more moderate, right? What they really are is corporate and conservative and corrupt. So great work here from Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting to figure out that the media is not at all covering what is the obvious incentive for Manchin and Sinema to oppose this package. So I am deeply disappointed by where we are. I'm not naive enough to be surprised by where we are, but I'm deeply disappointed by it. This, you know, the left constantly being told no on every little thing, even the most minor and compromised and moderate reforms, is, you know, to be in that state perpetually is it beats you down. It really wears people out. And I'm feeling that way. I understand that the viewers are probably feeling that way too. The little that we might have gotten, it seems to be swept out the door, right? How many months are we in now to Biden's administration? Again, not that I was naive enough to expect much, but boy, he even disappointed me. You know, congratulations. So this is, you know, and then and everyone watch in the midterms, the Democrats will come out and complain that the voters didn't turn out, right? You just watch. After they do fuck all, after they do nothing, they have both houses of Congress, they have the White House, they do nothing. Go back on promises that would simply take the signature of the president. They refuse to do it, and then they'll wonder, well, why didn't people show up at the polls? It'll just, that narrative, it's a cycle, right? It's a cycle. And then when Republicans take power and they're awful, it'll be, well, you got to put us back in because look how bad they are. It's just a cycle. So this is why activism, organizing, protests, strikes, very, very important. And we're going to get to some strike stuff later today as well. Right now, though, I want to talk about Jeff Bezos and other Amazon executives lying to Congress. This is in Business Insider. 5 lawmakers accuse Amazon executives, including Jeff Bezos, of either misleading or lying to Congress. Wow, that's a long scroll. Lots of ads on Business Insider, huh? 5 lawmakers have written to Amazon accusing executives, including former CEO Jeff Bezos, of either lying or misleading Congress while testifying under oath, the Wall Street Journal and Reuters reported. The lawmakers wrote to Amazon CEO Andy Jassy, on Sunday, asking him to provide evidence that the executives had not misled Congress when they testified that Amazon did not use third-party seller data to copy products and that it did not favor its own in-house brands, Reuters reported. Amazon denied that executives had misled lawmakers. The letter comes after 2 separate news publications reported Amazon's treatment of third-party sellers on its platform. Reuters reported Wednesday that Amazon's India business had systemically copied smaller sellers on its platform and rigged its search results to boost its own brands. Tech news site The Markup published an investigation Thursday reporting that Amazon placed its in-house brands ahead of its competitors' products. In the letter, lawmakers said that credible reporting by Reuters and others directly contradicts the sworn testimony and representations of Amazon's top executives, including former CEO Jeffrey Bezos, according to a copy of the letter viewed by Reuters. So for those of you who couldn't follow that, what they basically did is they went and copied the top selling products. So they went and looked at the stats they had of their sales. They copied the most popular products down to down to the centimeter of measurements on a shirt in one instance that they copied a popular series of shirts. Okay. So they went and stole products, effectively stole the design of products from companies that were selling through Amazon. And then once they created the Amazon basic version of that product, they would prioritize their own product in their algorithm. So that when you go on Amazon to purchase something, the first thing you see is the Amazon option. So they're not only stealing their products from other companies, they're then deprioritizing the companies that they stole the products from. And then they went up in front of Congress and fucking lied about it. And this is, Amazon to their core. This is who they are. So I also have here a very hilarious compilation that was put together. This is not only Amazon, but it does include Jeff Bezos. This is from Public Citizen. Great follow on Twitter if you don't follow them, at public_citizen. They say big tech CEOs in front of Congress. Jeff Bezos. You see the meme. Mark Zuckerberg, Tim Cook, and Sundar, who I'm going to butcher that name, I apologize, Piquet. This is honestly a disgrace. These unacceptable tech oligarchs need to have their companies broken up. And what he's referring to here, we'll watch this clip. I apologize if you guys can't hear this. Fantastic stuff there. I apologize if you guys couldn't hear the audio, but you could see the subtitles there. It was basically top executives explaining to Congress that they know nothing about the happenings at their company. Of course, this is a classic legal strategy. You just say you don't know, or you don't recall, or you're not sure, or you weren't part of that conversation, or it's just a dodge. It's such an obvious dodge. So when Bezos was asked whether or not they engaged in this kind of anti-competitive behavior and prioritizing their own products through their algorithm, he said he did not know of any example of that happening, right? Pretty obvious what's happening there. So this is just what Amazon does. This is why they are such a huge problem. They, how is a small business supposed to compete with that, you guys? Think about it. Amazon not only is the retailer, so they're not only doing what the Walmarts and the Targets of the world do, which is to basically go into a town and shut down all the small businesses around them because they can't compete. They're not only doing that, they're also the platform holder in this case. They're online. They own the fucking website, and they manage the algorithm that determines what you see and what you don't see. So they not only are sweeping out small businesses in the same kind of retail sense that other businesses do, they also get to own the platform and manipulate it that way. So, this is why Amazon is so immensely harmful for our world and our economy, and that they try to portray themselves as progressive is nauseating, and that it actually works on some people is even more nauseating. Jeff Bezos is certainly not progressive. You guys don't fall for that shit. Neither is Jassy, or whatever their new CEO's name is. They exploit workers. They squash unions. We all know the stories. And then they turn around and engage in this kind of stuff too, on a broader scale. Anti-competitive behavior. It's detrimental to small businesses. And it's outright theft too, you guys. Like, can you imagine if a small business was caught just stealing a product from Amazon? I mean, imagine what would happen to that small business. They'd be in legal trouble for years, be waist deep in legal problems. What does Amazon do? They just lie to fucking Congress and no problem, right? They know they got their connections. It does fortunately seem as though there are at least a handful of members of Congress who are seeking accountability in this instance. So we'll see what happens with that going forward, but it's unsurprising to find that Amazon once again engaged in a scandal. So I want to talk about some of the unionization stuff going on, or the strikes, the labor movement, the I don't know what we want to. I've heard it called Striketober. It's fantastic to see all of these strikes happening, and it's it's just heartening from a progressive perspective to see this, because in so many cases we just, like with the reconciliation situation, we don't get what we want, right? We don't even get close to what we want. We don't even get the scraps that we compromised for. And to see the labor movement propelling itself forward is, to me, a sign of hope that we actually could achieve some things, because strikes and protests are infinitely more effective than the electoral politics avenue, in my view. So want to start here with the John Deere situation. We have an update here. This is in Quad City Times. Deere and UAW still in active negotiations. Workers will receive CIPP payments and healthcare benefits for now. John Deere had threatened to basically remove healthcare benefits from striking workers to try to pressure them into halting their strike. There has been enough public outrage over that to reverse that decision. Deere & Co. and the United Automobile, Aerospace, and Agricultural Implement Workers of America are still actively participating in daily negotiations, according to a Deere executive. The Deere executive, who is involved in ongoing negotiations but has asked not to be named or directly quoted, said they are unable to speculate on when the two parties might reach a new tentative agreement. Deere is working on listening to its employees and understanding their needs, and wants to come up with a favorable outcome, according to the executive. You see again how the media frames this shit. No, they are not. They're interested in maintaining as much of the exploitation that they currently get to benefit from as possible. They currently enjoy. The voted down 6-year offer from Deere would have raised wages by roughly 5% over the life of the contract. Guys, it was so grossly inadequate. They were going to get like a couple bucks over 3 years. It was just disgustingly inadequate. The deal also limited retirement benefits for workers hired after the contract was ratified. Deere workers have faced forced overtime and poor treatment from managers and other company leaders, multiple employees said, on the condition of anonymity, fearing retribution. But because, from the paragraph above there, these employees fear retribution because John Deere is so committed to making sure that the employees, anyhow, it just drives me up a wall how the media frames this stuff. Fearing retribution. They said the last contract offer was unacceptable, especially considering the company's record high profits over the past year. For the 2020 fiscal year, Deere & Co. net income totaled $2.751 billion, according to the company. They can afford to provide decent wages and benefits to these employees and decent working conditions to the employees. So in the Deere situation, and we covered this last week, it was rather hilarious. They tried to bring some of their office staff down to the warehouse, and you guys remember the Ken Klippenstein tweet. They had a 911 call before 8 in the morning. They had an ambulance pulling into the warehouse, and another instance in the same day, one of those office workers crashed a tractor, right? So a point to be made there, by the way, hilarious as it is in so many ways, right? The non-union workers just fuck up immediately and repetitively. But notice the callousness with which John Deere treats all of its employees. They not only don't care about the blue-collar warehouse workers, one iota, they also don't seem much to care about their management level employees either, who they throw into the fire and say, go injure yourself for all we fucking care. All we need is the product, right? Notice the callousness with which they treat their own employees of all sorts. Welcome to capitalism, right? But that ought to be very revealing to people, that they are so quick to just chuck their office workers into dangerous situations like that. Incredibly callous, right? So it is good to see that the pressure has worked, at least to some degree, and that these employees are pushing for more and have denied what was a grossly inadequate offer. I am encouraged to see that in the John Deere situation. Want to show you guys a clip here from More Perfect Union about another strike update. New York City taxi drivers are on a hunger strike. This one is a remarkable and catastrophic story. It's just really sad what some of these people are going through, the amount of debt that they've incurred, and you know, people turning to suicide, and really depressing, horrific stuff here. So they are on a hunger strike demanding a better financial situation. So we'll watch this clip from More Perfect Union. If you're not following them, please do go follow them. They do fantastic reporting on all sorts of labor issues.
$638,000.
Yeah, I have $800,000 loan now.
I owe $598,000.
I owe $680,000.
I owe $650,000. Yeah, $650,000. Yes.
We said we were willing to do all that is needed. We meant it. We have been here for 32 days. We have shut down bridges. We are going on a hunger strike. There is nothing that we will leave unturned, no stone unturned, because what is being asked to be risked by these drivers is life and death.
Most of the medallion owners, they are like the immigrant, 95% are new immigrant. Now we have lost everything. Now we are the American nightmare now. We have a dream before, we are the American dream. Now we are American nightmare now.
The city advertised this as a ticket to the middle class life. They sold it in a way that was very appealing to immigrants, to people who speak another language, for people who really wanted to buy. It was advertised as buying a piece of New York.
My father unfortunately passed away 6 years ago, and left me with the New York City taxi medallion as well as a $530,000 loan. And he ended up just telling me how much he loved owning a piece of New York. He's just so proud of having this, and he knew that a piece of New York will be his interest to the middle class.
As the daughter of a taxi medallion driver and owner, I've seen intimately how the medallion crisis has changed over the past decade. I've seen how my father has struggled, working over 14-hour days just to make ends meet, to pay our bills, and to send me to school. In 2002, taxi medallions were worth about $200,000. But at the same time, New York City was facing over a $4 billion budget shortfall, in which the city was looking for a way to raise the revenue to close that gap. The way that they did this was to auction off over 1,000 medallions to many New Yorkers who thought that this was a ticket to a line of equity, a personal asset, and a ticket to middle-class life here in New York City. But many of the lenders who were involved in the medallion auctions were predatory, working off of working-class New Yorkers who couldn't understand a lot of the terms that were involved in many of these agreements. By the time 2014 rolled around, the values of taxi medallions skyrocketed to over $1 million. At the same time, around 2011 or 2012, e-hail services like Uber and Lyft were being introduced into New York City, but they were completely unregulated. So while the city was placing caps on the number of yellow taxi cabs that could operate in New York City, there was no cap on Uber and Lyft.
It's fair? I don't think so it's fair. They stole for us, miss, everything. My husband was 65. He didn't reach the retire. I feel sorry for him. He's gone. We have a wonderful life together. We just make a living, nice living. It's all. We don't want to get rich. And those people, they make us, they want everything to destroy for us. They want money.
My father purchased a medallion for about $245,000 with 12% interest. So now the medallion is about, I want to say he owed about $600,000 before he had filed for bankruptcy.
My brother Kenny Chow, unable to pay the mortgage, and he's struggling, he's devastated, and he lost all the retirement, he lost the investment, so he cannot make money, and he committed suicide near the Gracie Mansion, the Mayor de Brazia home, East River. this crisis, the city, they make the bubble, they create a bubble, they bust the bubble. So we need this, the city and the TSC commissioner, they have to fix the crisis. The city and TSC, they put on the bandage on the gun voters. It's not the real solution. So we need the real solution.
Under the city's plan, banks could stand to gain even more profit, even though our city has already regulated over $855 million in profit from drivers already. It's not a debt relief plan. It's a bailout plan from the banks who don't care about real debt relief and dignity for drivers.
When bank calls you, you don't have the money to pay, and you live with your family, and you don't know there's no money for your food and clothes for your kids, and the bank keep calling you. It's very, you cannot sleep during the night. That's how difficult it is. We have to do anything, hunger strike, anything to make sure the city understand our cause.
This is a workforce that has been so super exploited. There has been such a sense of despair among the drivers. And so to see drivers get past the suicides and the bankruptcies and all the heart attacks and the strokes and the utter level of despair and depression, to now being on the streets, refusing to leave until justice is won, having the courage to shut down a bridge in the middle of a morning rush hour, it's thrilling. It's workers taking back control over their life.
We don't want the mayor to pass this on to a new administration coming in 2022. What we need to do is have him in his last 83 days or 82 days in office, make sure he includes a city-backed guarantee to the federal funds that were secured for this type of debt relief. If Mayor Bill de Blasio and our city government align with the New York Taxi Workers Alliance plan and put it to work, that could mean a transformational change for my family and thousands more across our city.
Fantastic work there from More Perfect Union as usual. Devastating stuff, but I like the way they closed it on the encouraging note of, despite all of this devastation, look at what they're doing. And there's a touch of hope and optimism there in seeing these movements continuing to take place. Shame on Bill de Blasio for going with the package that would have bailed out the lenders and left the drivers out to dry. Unsurprising, but shame on Bill de Blasio. And shame on these banks for, as they always do, treating the situation in a way that is incredibly callous to everyday working people. And this is a real, I remember when this became an issue, you guys, and Uber and Lyft kind of started to take over for these taxi drivers. And when you start to understand, that was not a long video, but it explained pretty well how the process actually works to get a medallion in New York. And what that means for them when you then just open up the ride sharing industry with no cap on it, right? And of course, Uber and Lyft also incredibly predatory companies. They also try to treat their drivers like contractors so that they don't have to pay for any of the expenses on the car or gas. They don't have to meet labor laws or pay a minimum wage because they can call them private contractors. This was, borne out in the whole initiative, or proposition. I wish I could remember the number of it in California. And, so it all just kind of creates an environment where taxi drivers are completely left out to dry. And because of the nature of the scarcity of medallions in New York, they end up with that interest rate. I think he said 12% or something like that. They end up with hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt. You saw how many people there said, I owe, over $500,000, 600,000, just insane for a working class person. And, for the crime of working hard and trying to earn a middle class lifestyle. What a crime these people committed, right? So powerful stuff there from More Perfect Union. And I hope that this strike ends up working out, as I hope all of these strikes end up working out. It's, you know, it's devastating what capitalism does to us, and seeing this kind of pushback in a somewhat unanimous fashion across all industries, across the country, is quite encouraging. And we do have a couple more to get to here in terms of this labor movement. I want to show you guys. Here we go. Tweet here from Jonah Furman. He covers labor issues as well. Go give him a follow, just at Jonah Furman. He says the Kaiser strike just keeps growing, with UFCW locals joining the wave of unions authorizing strikes against a proposed two-tier contract. He's retweeting the Alliance of Healthcare Unions, saying 5 alliance unions, and they list them off there in their Twitter handles. SoCal locals have announced their members voted overwhelmingly to authorize strikes. In total, 36,000 alliance members are eligible to strike now. So Kaiser Permanente, obviously the healthcare company, also facing a strike from their workers at the moment, in addition to all of the other ones that we've covered. So it's just fantastic news, you guys. It's really, really fantastic news to see it becoming this sort of universal across all industries and across all locations. On a couple other interesting notes here, actually, I want to show you guys this one first. We covered how minor league baseball players this was also More Perfect Union, are really treated like shit. We kind of think of athletes as having it made, right? Like, I think it's ridiculous when athletes make $30 million a year or whatever for being talented at a sport. That's fucked up in its own right. But one thing we don't often think about is how exploitative these sports are in their own way. And with baseball, major league clubs treat their minor league players like shit. The More Perfect Union had a video where a minor league player explained that, usually players live like, 3, 4, 5 guys to an apartment. They end up sleeping on mattresses on the floor and sharing rooms and stuff like this, not making much money, not eating good food, not having access to any sort of quality of life during the season. And we have an update here. This is from Jeff Passan, who's one of the big baseball reporters. He says, breaking, Major League Baseball teams will provide housing for minor league baseball players starting in 2022, sources tell ESPN. So that's a huge piece of what minor league players were asking for. And I wanted to cover this as kind of I want to remind people that labor movements really do work, that strikes really do work, and that drawing attention to this kind of exploitation and drawing public outrage really does make a difference. It's never fast enough, you guys. Obviously, progress is never fast enough. But this is great to see. A matter of weeks later, they end up getting one of their major demands. So that's encouraging as well. This is kind of an optimistic segment compared to what I'm usually covering. And one other thing pertaining to sports that I wanted to cover that's also part of this whole labor situation. And this one kind of provokes a bigger picture question about work in the first place. This is in these times. A new group to organize college football players just launched. Incredible timing. After last week's NLRB memo made the unionization of college athletes a possibility, the CFBPA could become very important. So that's the College Football Players Association. It's not quite a union, but a players association is an organization made up of players that represents them during collective bargaining with the owners in sports. Okay, so it's a form of, unions are obviously a more comprehensive form of collective bargaining. So the Players Association is, in many senses, there to do the same thing as a union would be, to represent the players in negotiations. So this is encouraging to see, because college football players have long been exploited to the benefit of network executives and universities who operate like businesses. They sacrifice their bodies for entertainment, for a multi-billion-dollar industry. College football is like tens of billions of dollars, you guys. And where's that money going right now? It's going to ESPN executives, right? And it's going to chairman of colleges and shit like this, the major bonuses that are handed out to, it's going to the college football coaches who make millions and millions of dollars a year. The players who are sacrificing their body get nothing. And of course, the NLRB has now said that they can do, they can essentially engage in sponsorship, so they can make money from outside private companies and these kinds of things, which they previously could not do. Carrying on here, last week, a memo from the top lawyer of the Biden administration's National Labor Relations Board, Jennifer Abruzzo, asserted that certain college athletes should be legally considered employees. This decision took a wrecking ball to the myth of the student athlete and opened the door for the unionization of players in big-time college sports. For one recently launched group, the timing could not have been more fortuitous. The College Football Players Association formally launched in July with the goal of promoting labor organizing among college football players. Now the nascent group finds itself presented with an unprecedented gift from the NLRB. Few competitors in its newly energized space and a clear path to becoming a leader in the drive to transform college sports forever. All they need now are the college football players. The CFBPA is the brainchild of Jason Stahl, a former professor at the University of Minnesota who became concerned about the exploitation of the school's football players while he was teaching many of them in his classes. He left the school last year amid disputes over its treatment of players and began working on a book about the topic. He put together the CFBPA with the belief that some kind of players association is necessary to enable players to begin organizing effectively. Stahl is the group's executive director. Its advisory board includes current and former college players, ethics and labor law experts, and former University of Minnesota Regent Michael Sue, a longtime advocate of paying college athletes. And Jason, I saw an interview with Jason, and he said that his goal in this is to get to the point that individual universities or conferences begin to form like actual unions. So the players would have both a players association to represent them in negotiations and a union. This really fascinates me on a couple of levels. I mean, first of all, I'm always thrilled to see better collective bargaining for workers. But in this case, we do this arbitrary thing, and we have done for a long time this arbitrary thing where we say college athletes are not workers, even though they are obviously providing entertainment, and in any other context would be paid for their talent and for their work. But because they're students, they shouldn't be paid. Like what is the justification for that? There is none. That's absurd. It's insane. The only justification for that is if you want all the shareholders at ESPN and ABC and TNT or whoever the fuck covers college sports and has these massive contracts with the various conferences in the NCAA. If you want the shareholders of these massive networks to monopolize those profits, then you can justify not treating college athletes as workers. But otherwise, like, there's just it's so arbitrary. There's no logic behind that whatsoever. Can you imagine, like, TNT covers the NBA? There's an example, specific example. Can you imagine if TNT got to hoard all of the profits and the players did not see a dime? And we just said, well, they're athletes. Like, it's so arbitrary and ridiculous. It's insane. What if LeBron James went and took an online class? Does that mean he shouldn't get paid because now he's a student athlete? I mean, like, do you see how absurd this is? So I think this opens up a broader question about what work actually is. And we talk a lot about this with the federal job guarantee and the sort of wide range of types of jobs that we could utilize people for. To think outside the box in terms of what a job might look like for each individual person and how that job might serve to better society. There are a number of ways that we can go about that. And I really do think one of them is entertainment, you guys. Like, obviously, when we talk politics, we're talking about so much more important things than sports. I am kind of a sports nerd. It's my, like, when I want to turn my brain off from all the shit that's happening in the world, I love to sit down and watch a game and follow the movement of players and all that kind of stuff. It's something I can focus on that doesn't really matter, if that kind of makes sense. It's like turn off all the stuff that makes me angry and focus on this because it's, that kind of thing. So I think there's value in that. I really do. And I'd like to see the financial structure of that, or the economics of that, altered quite drastically, just like I would like to see those structures altered quite drastically in other industries, right? I think that the players should receive a lot more money. I also, in the case of sports, I think the person serving you your beer at the stadium and walking around with peanuts at the baseball game, I think that person should get a lot more money than they currently are. I think they should get more share of the profits than they currently are. And the security, the person checking your ticket at the door, all these people, the people working at the team shop, whatever, right? Like, there's exploitation in sports too, even when the athletes are making $30 million or $20 million or whatever the fuck. And that's absurd, of course. But it's an interesting angle to the whole labor thing, is why I wanted to bring that up. But on the by and large, incredibly encouraged to see the push for unionization in various contexts, the striking and protesting in various contexts, and that this is happening all across the country and all across various industries. It's heartwarming, and I can very seldom say that on this show, covering current events and politics. This is genuinely heartwarming to see, and I hope it keeps up. And we're starting to see some results. Again, never fast enough, but we see that this works. We see that this kind of pressure does genuinely work. Okay. So encouraging shit with all of these strikes, you guys. It's really fantastic stuff. I want to talk now a little bit about how Israel has decided to designate human rights organizations as terrorist groups. This is just utterly insane. This is in NPR. Israel designates 6 Palestinian human rights groups as terrorist organizations. Activists said Saturday they hope an international backlash will help reverse Israel's designation of 6 Palestinian human rights groups as terrorist organizations, a label that effectively outlaws them. 2 of the 6 groups said they would not be forced underground despite the uncertainty of their new status, which would allow Israel to raid the group's offices, seize assets, arrest employees, and criminalize funding and expressions of support. Activists said they seek to challenge the decision by Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz. Israel's terror label for the 6 groups, including some that receive European funding, appears to have caught the United States and Europe off guard. It could force them to pick a side at a time when efforts, I think they said efforts twice there, when efforts to negotiate the terms of a Palestinian state alongside Israel are hopelessly bogged down. For years, the U.S. and the EU have largely focused on conflict management, including strengthening Palestinian civil society, while not exerting overt pressure on Israel to halt its ongoing settlement enterprise on occupied lands the Palestinians seek for their state. So this is a tactic to basically criminalize not supporting Israel, you guys, and we see this all too often, again, in various contexts across the United States. We see, attempts to essentially outlaw free speech, to say that, if you support boycotting Israel or BDS, that you cannot receive federal funding, things like this. It's incredible. There's really not a faster way. With all the talk of quote unquote cancel culture and all this stuff, there's not a quicker way to get yourself canceled than to support Palestinian rights and to criticize Israel's ethnic cleansing campaign in the West Bank and Gaza. There's not a quicker way to get yourself canceled, you guys. One fantastic example of this is a horrific actor in our political process, Bari Weiss. She fancies herself or portrays herself as a free speech warrior and talks a lot about cancel culture and this kind of thing. And yet, she constantly, and I really literally mean constantly, tries to get professors fired for supporting Palestinian rights, going all the way back to her college days when she tried to get professors fired for supporting Palestinian rights. Calls herself a free speech warrior. I mean, if you can't see the rank hypocrisy, the contradiction there, I don't know what to say. But that's pervasive in our society, and that's what this is. If they can designate these groups as terror organizations, they can affect the narrative in their way, and in their favor rather, and they can essentially kneecap the ability for human rights organizations to fund, to oppose their ethnic cleansing campaign, to oppose their genocide, to oppose their human rights violations, right? So it's a way to inundate themselves from any sort of critique or any sort of accountability for their crimes. And it's unsurprising to see this, but it's just a continuation of how they have treated Palestinians for decades and decades and decades. And it's unfortunate that Biden has been as soft on Israel as he has, although again, not at all surprising. Not at all surprising. So I stand with Palestine. I don't really know what to say here. I don't see the situation as very hopeful, because none of those in power seem to have the slightest intention to act in a way that would at all hold Israel to account. The United States obviously has the power, because we provide Israel with so much of its weaponry and defense, to influence their policy here. We could simply say, We are cutting off all funding and all sale of weapons to you tomorrow until you're done with your ethnic cleansing campaign. But we refuse to do so. And, you know, despite the UN's attempts to criticize them and hold them to any form of account, the United States uses its veto power to stop even like statements coming from the United Nations to condemn Israel's war crimes. And, you know, this is just a continuation of that pattern. So, unfortunate situation, obviously, and it's unfortunate as well that it has stopped receiving coverage months ago when there was a lot of actual violence going on in the region. This was getting a lot of media coverage. Now, that coverage was misframed in many cases, but it was getting a lot of media coverage, especially in independent circles. And now, even though the violence is still going on, it's just a little bit less overt. Now the coverage stops and the discussion seems to stop. So they had a ceasefire that lasted like days. I mean, and that cut off the media coverage, right? So it's important to stand with Palestine. It's important to stand with all oppressed groups and marginalized groups, and that certainly includes the Palestinian people, and that certainly includes these human rights organizations, which Israel has very disingenuously and dishonestly labeled as terrorist groups. So shame on Israel once again, and we'll keep up with that story as it develops. Want to do a quick little kind of side note of a story here. This was a tweet from the Gravel Institute. They are also fantastic. If you do not cover that or follow them, rather, it's at Gravel Institute. They say 10 years ago, Muammar Gaddafi, leader of Libya, was brutally murdered after a NATO military intervention led by France and the United States. Here's what an aide to Hillary Clinton said in a private email to Hillary about the real reason for the intervention, or reasons, rather. And just quickly, you guys, I'm not a fucking Gaddafi fan. Obviously, the dude is pretty awful in a whole plethora of ways. But if you don't know how he died, he was impaled on a bayonet, beaten and shot by protesters, by whatever you want to call them, freedom fighters. Okay, that were supported by the United States. So, pretty horrific way to go, and that happened 10 years ago today as a result of Hillary Clinton. And then she famously went on 60 Minutes and said, what was it? We came, we saw, we died, I believe was what she said, with a smile and a chuckle. Really disgusting. Vini Vidi Vici in that context. What a disgusting thing to say, right? And then laughed about it. Very Hillary. Anyhow, this is the leak that the Gravel Institute shared out. Source comment: according to knowledgeable individuals, this quantity of gold and silver is valued at more than $7 billion. French intelligence officers discovered this plan shortly after the current rebellion began, and this was one of the factors that influenced President Nicolas Sarkozy's decision to commit France to the attack on Libya. According to these individuals, Sarkozy's plans are driven by the following issues. A desire to gain a greater share of Libyan oil production. B, increase French influence in North Africa. Unclassified U.S. Department of State case number, whatever, doc number, whatever, date 12/31/2015, improve his internal political situation in France, provide the French military with an opportunity to reassert its position in the world, and address the concern of his advisors over Gaddafi's long-term plans to supplant France as the dominant power in Francophone Africa. Okay, guys, listen to all those. Those are all political reasons. Those are not valid reasons to execute a coup. And yet, what did we do? What did we and France do, right? So I just wanted to, I thought that was great that the Gravel Institute shared that out to keep in people's minds what actually drives our foreign policy decisions like Libya, and, you know, keep that kind of front of mind as we evaluate other foreign policy issues going forward. So just a quick little side note there in case you had forgotten how horrendous Hillary Clinton was and how horrendous the United States general foreign policy is, and what actually drives those decisions. So when the State Department or the Pentagon comes out and says, we did X, Y, or Z for human rights, or we wanted to help people or whatever, go read that memo. It's always about politics. It's always about resource acquisition. It's imperialism. It's always about the military-industrial complex. It's some collection of these perverse incentives will be the actual reasoning and justification for our outrageous foreign policy and the violence that we inflict upon people all around the world. So to talk a little bit here about inflation. This has gotten a lot of discussion. It's a topic that's gotten a lot of discussion lately, with the supply chain issues leading some misguided individuals to describe what we've seen as inflation. Of course, supply chain crashes cause prices to go up for very obvious reasons, right? Supply goes down, you end up with higher prices. And this is a result of COVID. Anytime you have a crisis of this degree, your supply chains are going to get hit by it. Also, some other like weird things that have happened along the way, not the least of which actually was that Suez Canal blockage for a long time. That has like months of reverberating effects, you guys, when shipping is that disrupted. Things like that. It's a weird time right now. And so lots of people are experiencing price increases because of those supply issues. So I want to read a portion here from an essay written by Stephanie Kelton. If you have not followed Stephanie's work, The Deficit Myth is absolutely fantastic. And she has tons of interviews, lectures, etc. that you can find online. She's a professor at Stony Brook University. She's an economist. She's one of the foremost authorities or most outspoken supporters of modern monetary theory, which we talk about quite a bit here at Real Progressives. And she just a few days ago posted this article, which on her Substack, which quotes parts of an essay that she wrote for the New York Times, I believe it was New York Times essay, yeah. And it's just it pertains to the current situation. So I want to read you guys what she shared here. The key to responsibly spending vast sums of money lies in carefully managing the economy's real productive limitations. Depending on how big Congress ultimately decides to go on infrastructure and how quickly, it may need to unleash a whole suite of inflation-dampening policies along the way. These mostly non-tax inflation offsets could include industrial policies, like much more aggressively increasing our domestic manufacturing capacity by steering investment back to U.S. shores, using even more carrot incentives like direct federal procurement, grants and loans, as well as more sticks like levying new taxes to discourage the offshoring of plants. Reforming trade policies is another option. Repealing tariffs would make it easier and cheaper for American businesses to buy supplies manufactured abroad and easier for consumers to spend more of their income on products made outside of our borders, draining off some domestic demand pressures. The Biden team could also consider loosening its legal immigration policies so that even once America nears full employment, there would still be an adequate labor pool to meet the increased demand for workers. Putting aside the obvious climate benefits of tightening environmental regulations, banning fracking on federal lands and offshore drilling in federal waters could free up people and materials for other activities. Healthcare reform could have a role too. Significantly lowering the Medicare eligibility age would sharply reduce aggregate spending in the healthcare industry, a major source of price pressures in the economy. Over time, the Biden plan's investments in our physical and human infrastructure will enhance our economy's productive capacity, leaving us with a better educated and more productive workforce, more efficient railways, less congested roadways, improved technologies, and much else. But this can't happen overnight. It will take years, and it might mean that we start to run out of available capacity as we go, especially if the House Progressive Caucus wins the addition of trillions more dollars. No one can predict exactly when or across which industries serious bottlenecks and other shortages might emerge. That's why, to avoid short-run constraints like supply bottlenecks, the U.S. government can look elsewhere for capacity. American businesses can make use of depressed conditions abroad, buying from countries with economies that might be struggling to fully recover from the economic downturn, and that will be more than happy to mutually benefit from our boom. So it was unfortunate that in his long-awaited infrastructure speech, President Biden promised not a contract will go out that I control that isn't for a company that is in an American company, that is an American company with American products, all the way down the line, and American workers. This Buy American philosophy is well-intentioned, but could lead to counterproductive trouble, particularly since the president has promised that no one making under $400,000 will see their federal taxes go up, a pledge that takes raising taxes on the middle class, which has a higher marginal propensity to spend, off the table as a potential inflation offset. A Biden-led plan that is overly protectionist is a much greater inflation threat than a plan that isn't paid for in the traditional deficit-neutral budgetary sense. This framework, based on the principles of modern monetary theory, redefines fiscal responsibility by flipping the age-old question, how will you pay for it? The real challenge is, how will you resource it? So great stuff there from Stephanie Kelton. I encourage anybody who's interested to go read the entirety of that essay she wrote for the New York Times. But she explains there how the Biden administration could potentially go about offsetting inflation risks if they spent to the degree that that was becoming a problem. Of course, the latest reporting on the infrastructure and reconciliation situation, which we covered earlier, would suggest that that inflation risk is pretty fucking low because the spending is just not going to be very high. But I wanted to address this, you know, inflation is in my experience often misunderstood, and it is also used and weaponized as a fear-mongering tool by the establishment to oppose spending on things that would be helpful to everyday people. Of course, no one ever worries about inflation when you're spending on things that the establishment likes: military budget, tax cuts for the rich, etc. So when you're increasing the deficit for those things, the question of inflation is never brought up at all. It's only when you want to spend on healthcare or education or housing reform or, you know, combating climate change that all of a sudden we have this, oh my God, inflation, holy fucking shit, you know. And I wanted to debunk some of those fears and put it in context, and also share with you Stephanie's views there on what could be done very easily to combat any potential inflation fears that any of you may have at home. And just to be very clear, MMT does acknowledge that inflation is a risk of spending. It's not that we say it's not. It's there's just nuance to that discussion, okay, and how pervasive inflation actually is, and how you actually achieve it, or achieve might be the wrong word, how you actually get it, right? How you produce it. So anyhow, encourage everybody to look into Stephanie's work if you're not already familiar with it. She is a brilliant economist, and she has written extensively about these issues from a modern monetary theory lens. If you have not read The Deficit Myth, go buy it. Deficit Myth, Stephanie Kelton. So I want to talk a little bit here about Julian Assange. This is a topic I just don't talk about as much as I would like to. It's a critical issue. Obviously, very core principles of journalism at stake in terms of how Assange has been treated. And I just want to give the reminder that I always give when we talk about Assange. Even if you take a hardline stance on leakers, that should not apply to Julian Assange. And I obviously don't take a hardline stance on leakers. I think that they're heroes. But to people who want to take a hardline stance on leakers, that still doesn't matter as it pertains to Julian Assange. Julian Assange is a fucking journalist. WikiLeaks is a journalistic outlet. So you should not, under any scenario, be prosecuted for or persecuted really in any other way for publishing information. That goes against the heart of the First Amendment and the journalistic principles that we uphold in this country, and the ethics of the press and free expression. Okay. This is in Common Dreams. Fate of anti-war journalism lies in upcoming Assange hearings. The press still has the power to challenge and prevent U.S. wars. However, this power hangs in the balance in the form of Julian Assange's fate. They also have the power to do a lot more than that, and a lot of that also hangs in the balance with Julian Assange's fate. Within just a few days, the United States will once again make its case in a UK court that it has a right to extradite WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange to be tried under the Espionage Act in what remains this century's most dangerous attack on global press freedom. These hearings, taking place on October 27th and 28th, are an attempt to appeal the decision that Judge Vanessa Baratzer made earlier this year to not extradite Assange to the United States because it is likely he will commit suicide if subjected to the inhumane conditions of the U.S. prison system. However, while this decision was focused on his health, these hearings are really about what Assange's case has always been about: the United States' determination to silence anyone who exposes the crimes of the U.S. empire. Leading press freedom and human rights organizations have been clear about the implications of a potential Assange extradition and have called on President Biden to drop the case. If there are still any doubts that the Department of Justice's focus on Assange was corrupt and politically motivated, those who remain skeptical should consider two major revelations about the U.S.'s campaign against Assange since the last hearing. Earlier this year, the Icelandic news outlet Stundin reported that a key witness in the prosecution against Assange admitted to lying in his indictment. This witness was, I'm not going to try to pronounce that name, I apologize, a convicted pedophile and fraudster. The FBI promised Thordarson, which was the convicted pedophile, from prosecution, immunity from prosecution under the condition that he lie about his relationship with WikiLeaks in an indictment which would strengthen the DOJ's conspiracy charge against Assange. So they engaged in a conspiracy to frame Assange for conspiracy. You cannot make this shit up. And Julian Assange still sitting in a jail and still potentially could be extradited, despite all of this coming forward. Along with the debunked claim that Assange pressured whistleblower Chelsea Manning into hacking a U.S. government computer, Thordarson's indictment was supposed to paint Assange as having a pattern of pressuring sources to commit cybercrimes. The Stundin article should put to rest any belief that the United States is being honest about its stated reasons for going after Assange. But the Stundin article is not even the most concerning glimpse into the prosecution's true character. Just this month, Yahoo News reported that Mike Pompeo, the main force behind Trump's decision to pursue extradition, was obsessed with punishing Assange for publishing the Vault 7 documents, which revealed the CIA's activities of electronic surveillance and cyber warfare. Though the Gray Zone initially broke this news in May of 2020, the recent Yahoo News report includes additional details of Pompeo's obsession. Most shockingly, Pompeo held such a vendetta against Assange that he considered arranging a shootout in the streets of London with the British government to assassinate Assange. Let me just repeat that. Pompeo held such a vendetta against Assange that he considered arranging a shootout in the streets of London with the British government to assassinate Assange. And Julian Assange is still the one sitting there facing charges of conspiracy. Who's conspiring? Mike Pompeo belongs in a prison cell. The Department of Justice officials who conspired with Thordarson to create false testimony to try to frame Julian Assange belong in a jail cell for conspiracy, not Julian Assange. It is still unclear if either of these facts will be considered in the UK court's upcoming hearings. There remains a dangerous lack of solidarity with Assange from the press, which is exactly why it is so important that this extradition not happen. As mainstream news outlets become increasingly complacent and even supportive of pro-war policies, it becomes more essential that anti-war voices and anti-war journalists in particular resist the attempt by the United States to set the precedent that the act of publishing war crimes is a punishable offense. This just could not be a more important story, you guys. It's of the utmost priority. If we don't have press freedom, we really have no avenue to change in any respect. And the treatment of Assange here is beyond egregious. It's totally ass backwards. Those who have treated him how they have treated him are the ones that belong in prison and belong facing charges. Not Julian Assange, who did not just his job. Let me just backtrack that a bit. Not only was what he did not unethical or legal, right? It was ethical, it was legal, he's allowed to do it. Not only that, it's admirable. It was good work. It's what we want out of our press. It should be praised, not condemned, and yet we're charging him for it. So many things in politics are backwards. Very seldom are they as backwards as this one. Julian Assange has what this man has had to go through. I mean, it just, when put in the context of the fact that he is a hero, it's all the more maddening. And that the press, as awful as they are in so many respects, that they can't even be bothered on an issue that speaks to the very principle of what they do. That they can't even be bothered in this scenario to stand up for their colleague and to oppose the condemnation of and prosecution of the principle of their work. I mean, you guys can see how worked up this gets me. We basically are now saying, if you criticize the United States in a way that the United States dislikes, that the State Department and the Deep State dislike, that the Pentagon dislikes, they will simply find a way to conspire to charge you. This is beyond horrendous. Whatever you can do to stand with Assange, whatever you can do to bring this story to the forefront, I encourage you to do. And here's to hoping that on the 27th and 28th, the UK does not choose to appease the United States and extradite Assange. And by the way, also, shame on Joe Biden for continuing the Trump administration's stance on Assange. Obama wasn't good on this either, you guys. All three of the every president that has dealt with Julian Assange has been awful on him. So for a country that prides itself on free expression and freedom of the press, we sure don't have it. Shame on all these presidents and their justice departments for continuing this shameful, disingenuous, deceitful prosecution of Julian Assange. And the last story I want to get to today, you guys, Ruth Bader Ginsburg did an interview years ago. Well, about a year ago, I guess it would have been, with Katie Couric. Katie Couric, obviously one of the bigger names in journalism in this country, unfortunately, in my view. I think she's pretty fucking awful, but many people know her, so she's got a huge platform, right? He interviewed Ruth Bader Ginsburg and decided to censor portions where RBG was, shall we say, insensitive towards the Black Lives Matter protests, outright condescending towards them, really flippant towards them. And she basically did so because she knew that RBG would get pushback for it. She violated the core of journalistic ethics in order to protect someone who she viewed as on her team. And before we dive into the specifics here, you guys, I just want to point out all of the cheerleading for the RBGs of the world is beyond misguided. Ruth Bader Ginsburg sided with corporations more often than she didn't. You know, there are aspects of her career that are admirable when she was with the ACLU. There are also a lot of aspects of her career that are far from admirable, and this interview will be one of those low spots, right? So don't make heroes out of these people, you guys. Don't do it. Just you end up breaking your own heart when you make heroes out of these people, okay? They're not worthy of that kind of treatment. Do not deify politicians. This is in The Hill. Kirk defends editing of RBG interview. Veteran journalist Katie Kirk defended her decision to leave out portions of a quote from the late Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg from a story she published in 2016. Oh, it was years ago. 4 years ago. 5 years ago. In the article for Yahoo News, Couric quotes Ginsburg as saying racial justice protests during the national anthem before football games are dumb and disrespectful. But Couric, in her book titled Going There, oh God, reportedly reveals that she omitted Ginsburg's full quote in an attempt to protect the late justice from criticism of controversial remarks. Yeah, you really went there, Katie, when you did your coverage that way, right? Wouldn't Going There be like, oh, we're going to send it. We're going to show you everything. No. What a nauseating name for a book. Jesus Christ. Carrying on, Ginsburg also said during her interview with Couric that the protest displayed contempt for a government that has made it possible for their parents and grandparents to live a decent life. Think about what that quote implies, by the way, you guys, if it didn't register the first time. Ultimately, I think I should have included it, Kirk said during an appearance Tuesday on Today, the NBC morning program she anchored for more than a decade. But I also think it's really important to look at what I did include. She had to make a statement afterwards saying her comments were harsh and dismissive. Kirk said she wished she had asked a follow-up question to clarify or had just run it and let her clarify it later. But I think the most pertinent and direct response to the question about Colin Kaepernick I included, and that's why I raised it, because maybe I should have done the other sentence as well, she said. So that last bit is literally, she contradicted herself in about 3 seconds. First, she says, I think the most pertinent and direct response to the question about Colin Kaepernick I included. And then she says, and that's why I raised it, because maybe I should have done the other sentence as well. She can't even keep her apology straight, you guys. So I wanted to cover this because it's an example of how mainstream journalists protect the powerful. Can you imagine if that was a Trump associate or if that was Brett Kavanaugh that she was interviewing that said that? I mean, she wouldn't have hesitated. She would have run with it, not just because that's the journalistic, like the ethical thing to do, the journalistically ethical thing to do, but because that would be the other team that she's attacking. Okay. It reveals the extent to which the most prominent sources in mainstream media totally ignore journalistic ethics and prioritize entirely other incentives like access journalism and playing to their team and, you know, appeasing their social circles and all this kind of shit. So shame on Katie Couric for that, for not telling us the truth. That obviously was newsworthy, and her redaction of it proves that she knew it was newsworthy, right? If it was an innocuous comment, she would have thrown it in. If she didn't think it would have caught attention, if she didn't think RBG would have been in trouble for that, she would have thrown it in, because why would she keep it out if she didn't think it was important, right? So the whole situation is an admission of how journalism works in this country, and how the press is intertwined with the maintaining of the status quo, because they want to maintain access to the powerful people who are currently most benefiting from and most enjoying that status quo. So shame on Katie Couric, shame on the mainstream press in general for engaging in journalism in this fashion and for so ignoring and undermining journalistic ethics. Those last two stories really quite important, you guys, in so many senses, especially the Assange one. Make sure that you're paying attention to press freedom and defending press freedom as best you possibly can. Here's to hoping Assange is not extradited, and here's to hoping that at some point some sort of public pressure gets to the Biden administration. And, again, I'm not naive enough to expect that, but I can hope, right? Positive stories today with the strike stuff. You guys keep up the labor organizing. If there's anything going on in your area, make sure that you're getting involved in whatever capacity you can. Community organizing, mutual aid, all this kind of stuff helps. Go help out some strikers, take them some water or food on the picket lines or whatever it might be. Get involved as best as you possibly can in these movements that are working in the right direction. And we'll continue to update on all of the major stories that we covered today. Want to once again plug realprogressives.org. You guys, all sorts of great articles and content. Patreon is there if you want to donate. You can find all of our podcasts. And with that, I will call it a stream. I hope everybody has a wonderful week, and I will see you all on next Sunday.